to find out which were the best and the worst performing bourses on the African continent in the last week. To take us through the figures and just to give us some perspective is Mike Barnes, who's from Securities Africa. Mike, thanks very much for coming through, and it's great to have you. The BRVM 10 in the Ivory Coast showed very strong performance, and so did the BRVM composite. And there's a sense that despite the go slow in business activity, the bourses have been boosted by the electoral process. Your view?
Absolutely right. I mean, the big story in both Ivory Coast as well as Sub-Saharan Africa, I suppose you could say, was the presidential elections, which went off relatively peacefully last week. Right. Obviously now there wasn't a definitive winner, so they're having the runoff between the current president Gbagbo and his biggest opposition Ouattara, which is next week, in a few weeks' time, November the 21st. Yes. And that's obviously propped up the whole of the market. And also both these political candidates have the same sort of policies, and they aim to boost health, education, agriculture, road infrastructure and energy. And as a result of this has boosted agro-processing stocks. Right. So you saw some of the best performing stocks being Palm CI, which was up 17% for the week, Shell CI being up 16% for the week. So the whole sector, agro-processing, was up 12.3%. So
nobody's really concerned about the fact that with the runoff election scheduled for the next fortnight, that there could be a dispute in the results, that there could be some electoral violence. There isn't any such concern?
There's been no sort of indication as yet. It is a worry, yes, possibly further down the line, but as of now, I think people were happy that it went away. It was the first proper elections in a while, so everyone was happy with that.
All right, the South African JSE, the all-share index, also a sterling performer in the last week, but we started to see the markets really propelled by news of a second phase of quantitative easing in the United States, flight from the dollar, many people are saying, into emerging markets. Is it a function of what's happened globally that the South African bourse is performing well, or are there fundamentals in South Africa?
I think you're very correct. It is mostly a global story. Obviously, most stock indices, if you looked at the Dow and the S&P, they were also up nicely last week. Obviously, the announcement of QE2 on Wednesday night, which was 600 billion as opposed to the 500 billion that people expected, has really given a nice boost of liquidity into the markets. And that naturally feeds through to the higher growth and higher yielding countries, which emerging markets is. It also gave a nice rally to the rand, which again propped up the JSE.
Okay, so also, I mean, I know that sometimes when you're looking at the figures for the best and the worst performing bourses, it's a currency issue, the currency relative to the dollar. Any opinions about the strength of the South African rand and whether or not we're going to see this as a prolonged issue?
Well, that's a million-dollar question, I suppose you could say. There's a lot of debate about it. Is the rand too strong? And perhaps it is. I know it hurts a lot of exporters. But you're quite right. I mean, it's you know, you look at Swaziland and Namibia last week, they were also very strong, and that's mainly because of the rand strength as well.
Okay, let's move on then to the worst and the worst performing bourses, and we have there both the indices in Zimbabwe, the mining index and the industrial index, declining respectively 4.27% and 3.37%. What's going on in Zimbabwe?
Well, a lot of people are saying perhaps it's a dollar weakness move, which is partly true, but the reality of it, I believe, is the previous week we saw a really big rally across all the Zimbabwe names, and I think this was just a bit of profit taking on the back of a lot of that.
Okay, just talking about dollar weakness, I mean, we do know that Zimbabwe is a dollarized economy, and so they're susceptible to whatever fluctuations in the US currency. Now that we're talking about QE2 and what's happening internationally, as we see a weakening dollar and a flight from the dollar, what sort of impact do you think that's going to have on Zimbabwe? Because the finance minister is quite bullish about growth at over 8%, he says.
No, absolutely. And we're seeing it from a lot of our international clients. There's a lot of interest now in Zimbabwe because a lot of people are buying into more political stability. So yes, on the one hand, you've got the dollar weakness, which obviously can create its own problems. But I think people are seeing a lot of potential in Zimbabwe. It's been depressed for a very long time now. So a lot of people are buying into that growth story, as you rightly say.
All right, let's move over to Nigeria. And this is a bourse that has yo-yoed, 1 week up, 1 week down, offering returns of just around 10% for this year. So it hasn't been a very good performer. What do you make of what's going on there?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, obviously in our universe of Sub-Saharan Africa, it's the biggest market, and so it's obviously very important to us. It has been up and down, very much so, but there's a lot going on. We've just had Q3 results from a lot of the corporates, particularly the banks, out in the last couple of weeks. Last week, I don't know, if you can read too much into it, because volumes are very low, and it's very difficult to obviously read performance into very low volumes. The one sector or subsector really bucking the trend was the distressed banks, which were up sort of the maximum virtually every day last week. And the reason for that was a lot of people are realizing that the AMCON bill could have these positive effects. They're also announcing the bidders for the names. So there was a lot of interest in that sector, although it seemed to reverse today a little bit. But Nigeria is tough to call. You know, we've got elections next year, which are now in April. Obviously, you'll have full year results before then. So there's a lot of factors there.
I mean, Nigeria is tough to call, but many people want to make that call, especially because they don't really know what to expect with the elections that are scheduled for April of next year. We've seen a fairly stable Naira. You talk about the distressed banks that rallied in the last week, but many people are saying when you look at what's happened with Oceanic in the last few days, you could rather say that it's a foregone conclusion that the rally will subside somewhat. Yes, we've got certainty in terms of the broader banking reforms, but the productive elements of the economy aren't very encouraging, and people are needing some other indication of whether or not Nigeria is on the fast track or not. What's your sense?
No, absolutely. I mean, those are very good points. I think a lot of people, as I said, it's the biggest market in our universe of sub-Saharan Africa, so a lot of people want to believe the growth story. People around the world are looking to Africa as the next growth story. So yes, you can look at the individual factors, but I think overall the positive growth story is still very much evident. And as we saw from the injection of QE2 money, I think the extra liquidity will naturally feed down to the higher growth, higher yield.
For somebody watching us right now very briefly and saying, which is a market I should be going into, Nairobi and the NSC in Kenya has been a sterling performer overall, despite fluctuations. That's been probably the best performing bourse, giving returns of over 33%. The JSE hasn't done too badly. People starting to gain some interest in Ghana, for instance. Where would you say by year's end people should be thinking about investing their money?
Well, Kenya is an interesting one. Obviously, as you say, it's been performing very well, but you know, it's in a low inflation environment at the moment, and a lot of people are looking to exit equities, to be perfectly honest, and looking to a booming property sector in Kenya. But you know, Zimbabwe is a very interesting play. As I said earlier, you know, it's been very depressed for a long time, so you can pick up stocks at a very low level. That's sort of my thinking. But we see generally quite a good disparity across all the markets. You know, a lot of investing across the board.